Mary Beth, welcome aboard to the show. Thank you so much for joining us today.
And thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
And the thing that struck me profoundly about your story, and we will share your story for the audience today, was that it feels like you're one in a million. The ability to pull yourself up by your bootstraps from maybe the lowest one can go to where you've become just seems unnatural. Let me ask you this. Do you believe anybody can undergo such a transformation, or is there something special about you?
No, I know many people who have gone through very significant transformations. Maybe they didn't end up a federal judge, but that's actually not sort of the crux or the most important part of my story. They certainly have gone from being debilitated, whether it's from addiction or trauma or mental health, and finding healing and finding sort of a robust, happy, productive life. The judge title is a little bit unusual, but the overall arc I think is fairly common. People are able to get the help that they need.
What was special about your journey where you were able to break a habit and kind of start really a new journey, a new road, and stick with it?
Well, I mean, I will share an actual positive data point to put that in context, which is we hear these stories about how only 10% of people that have an addiction ever recover, or 15%. And that is just not true.
Mm.
That's really a number focused on for each effort. And part of the reason that's low is that most people, including myself, can't be perfectly abstinent from day one, right? But if you look at lifetime, in their lifetime, 75% of the people who meet the criteria for having a substance use disorder, which
Mm.
is the modern name for addiction, they will recover to the point that they later don't meet that criteria. So I think we don't really understand that positive number, and I like to share it to give hope to the person struggling, but also their friends and family who can also feel very hopeless and debilitated about the whole thing.
I love this. So it's a battle, so to speak. It's really about the whole war, the whole journey, not just that one battle that you're fighting.
Yeah, and I wasn't perfectly abstinent from day one either. I used 3 times in my first 5 months, and 3 times in 5 months was, like, vast improvement, right? But some people would say I sort of failed, succeeded, and I don't look at it that way. The reality is, I was 32 years old when I started recovery. I've been using drugs since I was 12. I had a lot of trauma pain. I had PTSD and anxiety, and I didn't know it. I didn't have the skill set to stay sober from day one. It's really a challenge for a couple reasons. One is in early recovery, so you're taking the drugs away. So what's going to happen? All the pain that you've been shoving down, or all the mental health symptoms you've been trying to keep at bay, they all flood over you. They can be overwhelming. Plus, you don't even have practice at doing positive, good things. All of that can take time to develop. So perfect absence from day one happens, but it's not the norm. And there's a lot of understandable reasons for that.
Reading kind of between the lines that you would advocate not for perfect, like, no, you can't touch it. And if you've touched drugs, you failed, but for incremental improvement.
Well, I think if somebody can be perfect, yay for them, but the reality is most of us can't. And so I think having that understanding can take away some of the shame,
Mm.
some of the fear, some of the remorse, and just really saying, okay, so I had a slip. Like I'm going to get back on schedule tomorrow or in the next day. And a lot of times what you see are patterns. Like somebody might start putting together longer periods of sobriety, or their relapses will be shorter. They'll be 4 days instead of 2 months or whatever it might be. And
Mm.
sometimes you have to really look at that bigger picture. But the other side of it is every time when I say to a newcomer or somebody who's struggling, when they have a relapse, what I say is, what can you do to strengthen your plan? What can you do to
Mm.
strengthen? And a lot of times what that means is they need things they're not getting, like they need treatment for their trauma. They need treatment for their PTSD, not just addiction treatment. Plus, we don't actually have addiction treatment readily available for everyone either. And so, do they need more peer support meetings? Do they need to build up a stronger, closer relationships with other people in recovery? There are things you can do to help you as you exit the relapse and start again. But at the same time, I'm not saying, hey, go relapse, have fun. What I'm saying is, there's a good chance you can't be perfect. Let's just all acknowledge that and then figure out how to make sure you stay on track over time.
And there was something really interesting. You were given an ultimatum, basically, go to AA or else. You did something again, which definitely wasn't following the path. What was that?
Yeah, so AA is 12 steps and there's other 12 steps, Narcotics Anonymous and, cocaine and all the anonymouses, and they can be that's peer support and it can be a good fit for many, but it's definitely not a good fit for a lot of other people. And so for me when I was in rehab, and this is in 93, but it still happens today. It still happens today. And they did tell me, they said 12 steps is it. Like this is the
Mm,
only way. And I gave them multiple reasons why it wasn't a good fit for me. And they still swore up and down that there was no option. And they told me like directly, you're going to fail, Mary Beth. You're not doing what we tell you. You're going to fail. And that was a real like surprise, like I wasn't expecting it. And so at first I just said, okay, well, I'm going to look for the parts I think I can use and just ignore the rest. And so, I did what they told me. I read the AA big book and the NA text, and I did all my rehab homework, and all of that. But when I got home, and now it's January of 94, and for probably you and definitely younger people, I will emphasize there's no Google in January of 94. Okay. But I got home and I thought, I wonder if it's true that there's no other options. And so I got my car and I went to the library, and it turned out there were other options. And so today those groups are like Life Brings Secular Recovery, which I'm on the board for. I use the parent of that. I'm on the board for She Recovers Foundation. There's multiple peer support options. And for me, I don't care what people choose. I just want them to know they have choices so they can research it and find the group that's going to be most comfortable for them, because then they'll have the best chance. If they go where they feel like the philosophy is consistent with their worldview and the meeting format is one that they like, and the people they're meeting sort of they're comfortable with, that's going to give them the best chance.
and keep me honest here. You ended up building almost your own program through this process. First of all, where was the motivation to? I mean, it's hard enough to go through a program, but to build your own program, it seems like just like so much more difficult. Where did the motivation come from that? And then, if you could share kind of the process of building your program, what did that look like?
So, more people do it today. In fact, today we talk a lot about individualized assessments for what's the right treatment plan for someone, but I didn't know anyone else who did it in my day. I did it because I was sort of forced into it, right? Because
Mm,
they told me there was nothing else and that wouldn't work. And so I viewed it as my job to listen and to
mm,
consider, because they knew more than I did. They knew more than I did. That didn't mean everything they were telling me was going to work for me, but some of it would. There were some good ideas there. I pulled some ideas out of 12 steps. I learned some things in rehab. So I s- I would listen during the meeting smoke break if somebody said something that sounded useful, So I really viewed myself as having that I should be proactive and looking for ideas. But then I was the decision maker. I just always
mm.
felt like I get to filter this. Is this going to work for me? Is this an idea that I think's a good fit, either, especially right now, something that I can use right now? And so I just always thought of it that way, that I was the decision maker, but I also had to be humble and admit that I don't know everything and I need to be looking for good ideas. And so that was sort of the crux of it. And today, like LifeRing calls that building a personal recovery plan.
Mm.
So it's definitely more common today than in 94. And I will say, some people really prefer that to the structure of 12 steps. 12 steps is very much, here's the 12 steps. They go in this order, work them in this order. For some people, that's a good fit. And for others, they balk at that, So
Right.
it's really just about what's going to work for the individual rather than trying to push them into the box that we know best or that we think they should be doing.
There was an element of ownership, right?
Mhm.
You built your program, that means you owned it. And
Yeah.
when people own their decisions, then that creates what we call intrinsic design. And intrinsic design, we know, creates much more powerful outcomes. So there's something almost trailblazing in the way you approached it.
Well, I mean, part of what I was doing, although I didn't realize it at the time, was sort of building up my confidence and my competence to sort of guide myself. Because
Right.
when I thought about it later, I realized what I was sort of doing was like an analysis, sort of like, okay, who am I? Like
Right.
recognizing who I was fundamentally, trying to figure out what's my goal here. How do I think I can get there? Building a plan. Like, for
Yeah.
example, I had to prioritize what I was going to work on because I had destroyed so much of my life. Like I couldn't possibly work on everything at once, right? So there was that prioritization process. What's my first goal? What's my first plan? What's my second goal? When can I start working on this other thing that's not on the highest priority list? So it was that process that it turned out actually applies to pretty much everything.
Everything in life, yes.
And so it
That's
sort of it made
beautiful.
me feel more comfortable that after all those years of seeing my life making choices that caused me to be going, down, 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 that I was finally figuring out how to build a foundation that was going to move me forward. And so it did help me. It was wrong of them to tell me there was no other way. That put
Mm.
my recovery at risk. But in the long run, taking ownership, as you say, did actually help me.
Yeah. This is brilliant. I mean, there's so much beauty in your story that is not necessarily intuitively visible. So I deeply appreciate that. Where was the moment where you understood, okay, I need to make a change?
Well, I will first caveat it with we don't really emphasize this rock bottom idea anymore because we don't want people to think you have to have a horrible rock bottom in order to recover because that's just not true. And it's actually advantageous to address any substance use disorder or addiction that's coming up at an earlier point. And so today we talk about let's deal with it at the mild or moderate level before it gets that severe. But for me, I did have what would be traditionally categorized as a rock bottom. I mean, I started using at 12. I was shooting methamphetamine by 17. I did a little better in college, but at the end of college, I started using meth again on a regular basis. I did not get sober till 32. So it's a really long haul. It's a lot of years. And by 32, I had in my terminology is I had worked my way down the
Down the
corporate
corporate
ladder.
ladder.
Yeah.
I love that. That was my next question.
Because I couldn't hold a job because I was using meth all the time, right?
Yeah.
And but more than that, I was having physical problems. I was feeling very hopeless, very much in despair, very trapped, like, in this little miserable box. And nothing was going right. I hadn't felt happiness or joy in a long time. I didn't really see a way out. I didn't
Mm.
believe there was a way out because I thought my trauma pain, which was deep and vast. I mean, I had a lot of different types of trauma starting as a young girl. I didn't think there was another way to manage that pain. And so it kept me stuck for a very long time. And then at 32, also, I was with a good partner, finally, a good partner. And he was done. Like he was ready to throw me out. And
Oh,
so it was all of that together that finally made me say, well, maybe I ought to go to rehab. Maybe I ought to go to rehab. And it's not that I thought I'm going to get sober and everything's going to be great. I thought maybe I can figure out how to make it better. Like maybe not good, but better than this. And that was like sort of as far as I could think. Is there a way to make it not this bad? Use less, have less chaos, have less misery. That was the edge of my ability to think beyond where I was.
I love that. The baby steps. Let's just take one step forward. That's beautiful. So now fast forwarding, you're at the end of recovery and you're like, well, maybe there's something that comes next. What were you thinking? What was that maybe?
I mean, when I went into rehab, I was thinking a couple things, and part of it was just, yeah, let's see if I can figure out how to not. You need to use the drugs on a daily basis. How to not be at this level. But I will say the other side of it was that I always knew that the violence, that the all the different, I had child physical and sexual abuse, multiple other sexual assaults, a violent boyfriend at one point. I mean, it was a lot. I always knew that was sort of underneath my drug use. And so part of it was thinking, well, part of the fear, but also part of the knowing what was, going to be necessary was that I would have to address that. And so it's fearful because I didn't think I could address it without maybe committing suicide or ending up, in the mental hospital or something like that. I didn't know that there was actually healing available to me. I didn't know if that was going to be possible. And so that is fear. Can I if I take away the drugs, how am I going to deal with this pain? If I take away the drugs, is that going to make me handle the pain in a way that's actually worse than the way
Oh,
I'm handling it now? Or is there really any way forward from here? So I did always know that those were connected. And that is a very common, connection, by the way, especially for women to have trauma and addiction be tied together. So those things were in the back of my mind, but there was a lot of fear. I remember when my husband was driving me to rehab, we're like, halfway there, and I looked at him and I go, I don't remember deciding to do this. I don't remember deciding to do this. And he gives me a look like, you're doing it, and but it was just the fear was overwhelming me. What are they going to expect from me? You're taking something away. What am I going to do without it? Like, just not really having trust or faith that there was a path forward.
When did the law come into the mix? When did the whole, I'm guessing you first became a JD, right? That's the first
Yes,
step.
yes. Well, I will. So all my stories tend to have complications. All right. So I graduated from Berkeley, and I had done a little better, and I say better, not good, better on drugs for the first couple years of college. But I started using meth again in January of my senior year of college. I had been accepted to Berkeley Law, a top 10 law school, to start in the fall. By the time I got there in the fall, I was in no shape to do it. I was so strung out. I couldn't get to class. It was terrible. I ended up having to withdraw. I handed back a top 10 law school because
Oh,
of my
wow.
addiction, and I knew it, and it was agony. So that's sort of where it started. Going to law school had been my original intention when I went to college. That was my goal. So that I lost it. I mean, I had to give it back because I knew I'd never finish. So now I get sober at 32. I have a Berkeley degree and actually good grades, but an embarrassing resume for the last 10 years, right? I mean, it's embarrassing. So my first professional goal was literally, let's not get fired again. I mean, like,
Mm,
honestly, that was my goal. It's because I needed to start where I was. Law
right.
school, being a lawyer, being a judge, that was, way in the background as a long ago goal that I had lost my connection to.
And how did you reconnect to it?
So I started working, and I literally started working like a part-time temp job. Like, that was where I started. And then gradually, I went into full-time work, permanent work, worked my way into like a supervisory job at a high tech company in Silicon Valley, which is where I lived. And then at 6 years sober, I finally thought, well, first I was getting older, right? I mean, I was, I got sober at 32. So I'm getting 38 in my late 30s. And it's really like, well, am I ever going to try to go to law school for real? And it felt like I either needed to do it or to admit I wasn't going to do it. Like, it was sort
Right.
of at that point in my life, but it was scary because I had ruined it, the first time. And so when I was 6.5 years sober, I started law school when I was 39 years old, and I graduated from Berkeley Law when I was 42. So
Wow.
that's how it sort of played out.
Wow. So I'm guessing that there must have been a fear that, well, how can I be a lawyer who represents the law with my background? Was there somebody who kind of helped you overcome that? Did you do it on your own? What did that look like?
Well, I actually had a criminal record, but it had been so right after high school, a month before I was supposed to go to college, and I grew up in New Jersey and I came to California for college. I graduated from Berkeley. A month beforehand, I got arrested for methamphetamine and hypodermics, and so I actually couldn't go to college because I wasn't allowed to leave the state because I hadn't had my trial yet. So I had to book college off for a year, and then I went to college. But they treated me very lightly. Like, they knew I didn't have a juvenile record, that I
Mm,
hadn't been in trouble. I've been in the newspaper for winning the most scholarship money in my high school. I mean, it was a small town. They knew who I was.
mm,
And so in my sentencing order, it said that if I didn't get arrested again, I think it was for 5 years, that I could get my record expunged, which means
mm,
erased, basically.
right.
Usually people have to go through this whole big process to get their record expunged, but in my sentencing order, basically said no more, arrests, expunged. And so I just had to file like a declaration. I haven't been arrested. Please expunge my record. And so that was there, but that was erased. But I was worried a little bit, like, what kind of drug questions will the bar ask or whatever. But the way it goes is, like, the California bar does not say, have you ever done drugs? Because they get way too many yeses, right? Like, that they're not going to ask that. It said something like, in the last 5 years, have you
Mm,
ever had a problem with drugs or done illegal drugs? Something like that. But I already had like 9 years sober when they asked me that. And then I worked for a big law firm, and then later I worked for the federal government. And when I worked for the Fed, the first time they just asked, I think they asked about 7 years and I had 14. And even when I became a judge, they only asked me about 10 years and I had 20. When I became a
Mm,
federal judge, I had 20 years sobriety. So I was always able to tell them nothing and tell the truth at the same time, which was perfect. But when I was a judge, I did disclose to them about
mm,
my history, not the details, but that I was in recovery because I joined the board for LifeRing, and that's like an outside activity, and I had to run
mm,
it through ethics. So that
mm.
was sort of the way my legal history interplayed with my legal career. It was, and even now, part of the reason it's sort of easier for me to talk about my drug history is that I was sober for many years before I became a lawyer, right? So I couldn't have messed up any cases or, anything like that, which makes it a little simpler for me to talk about.
Appreciate that. First of all, I mean, you're sharing such personal information publicly. I just want to say thank you for your humility and vulnerability that you're sharing with the audience. Let me ask you this. I'm assuming there were people that helped you along the way. Do you have any kind of story that you can share of somebody that your life would not be where it was without them?
Well, I would definitely say my partner, now husband. So when I went into rehab, he was really like at the end of his rope. Like in rehab, they do these family sessions, and
Mm,
so he would come for those sessions, and he was saying things like, "I think it's too late. She's burned too many bridges. I can't trust her." Like he was really scaring me because he was like really, really done.
mm,
But he did let me come home from rehab, which so I had a safe environment to go home to, which not everybody does. And so that's an
mm,
advantage. That was an advantage for me in stabilizing my recovery. He wasn't making any commitments or promises, but he sort of stood back to see what I was going to do. And then we did do couples counseling. Plus I
mm,
was in individual therapy, of course, for that trauma. So, and it's not just that we survived it. It's that as he saw my hard work and as he saw that I was moving forward, he became like my number one fan, my number one supporter. Like when I was applying to law school again, he was confident I'm getting in. Like to me, it's like, oh no, never going to let me back, Um, but it's really, I mean, part of what I want to say is I had some advantages in my recovery. I
right.
lived in a safe neighborhood. I lived in a stable household. I had a partner who, while he was hesitating, was ultimately on my side and supportive, and who was willing to do the work with me to make our relationship, to heal our relationship, and to build a strong relationship. And so, without that, probably many people make it without that, but those were definitely factors that really helped me, especially in my early recovery.
I have a hard question for you. When you look at the social environment, the legal environment, the kind of cities and facilities, if you had supreme power for the day, what would be the one thing, law, structure, facility? What would you change if you could change just one thing?
I would decriminalize all personal use of drugs, and I would recommit the monies that are spent on policing and incarcerating, which, is billions of dollars every year. And I would reinvest them in treatment, harm reduction, housing supports, employment supports, other mental health treatment, so the what we call co-occurring disorders are also helped. In other words, to give people the best possible chance at building a good sober life for themselves. I think that would be better. I mean, the truth is, I think a couple reasons. One is that a high percentage of the people arrested for drugs actually do have an addiction, which,
Mm,
our own government says is a medical condition, right? It's a
mm,
mental health disorder, but you're throwing people in jail for it. Well, that's a contradiction. But also, if people are just using for recreation, I don't really care. Like, why should I care? As long as they're adults and they're not hurting other people. But it's just also a vast waste of resources. We could treat 3 or 4 people for every one person we incarcerate. Like that's
cost
what the
wise.
numbers tell us. And we act like we sort of have treatment on demand. Anybody who wants treatment can get it, but we're nowhere near that. We're nowhere near that. And so it's one thing, let's decriminalize, but it really leads to so much more because we'd free up so much money that we could put to a better purpose, a more effective purpose. I mean, even if all you care about is effective use of your tax dollars, this would
Right.
actually work better.
Right. So let's play the devil's advocate together.
Sure.
So the argument would be that if it's not criminal, then more people will do it. So more people would go down that rabbit hole. So there is a function of their criminalization to actually prevent. Is that true? Is that merit? How do we disassemble that argument?
So the data doesn't show that. So, for example, there are states that have more punitive criminal laws around drugs and other states that have more liberal laws around drugs. The states with the more punitive laws around drugs don't have lower drug use rates, don't have lower addiction rates, and don't have lower overdose death rates. So that would be my response to that. The other thing is, if we weren't using those dollars for incarceration and police, that we could actually spend some of that money on preventative measures, because the one thing that would really help us reduce our addiction rate, which is
Mm,
one of the highest in the world, by the way, would be early intervention with use for trauma and mental health. Because the reality is that the two most common pathways to addiction are untreated trauma or untreated mental health disorders. So if you want to
mm.
talk prevention, let's take some of the money and actually spend it where it would have the result of reducing the likelihood of addiction.
So that path seems very reasonable to me, right? Deal with the pain in a more, conventional way, not through burying it under drugs. That makes sense to me. Let me go one step backwards. Preventing drugs on the streets.
Well, I don't mean to say we should spend nothing on trying to keep drugs out, but the reality is we haven't been able to do it so far.
Hmm.
We've had this, so-called war on drugs since the 70s, and the reality is that I've been sober for 31 years. Drugs are more readily available and cheaper today than they were when I got sober 31 years ago. So I'm not saying let's do nothing to try to stop, the importation of drugs, but at the same time, that's not the majority of the money we spend. The majority of the money we spend is on incarcerating people for personal use. And so that's the money that I'm really talking about. Let's not punish the individual. The other problem with criminalizing it is that we have a really vast racial disparity in the way we enforce our drug laws. So we don't even enforce our drug laws fairly. Like, white people use drugs at the same rate as people of color, but people of color are, many times over more likely to get arrested or for the charges to be a felony instead of a misdemeanor, and the sentences are longer. So we have a really unfair system on top of all the other problems.
Mary Beth, thank you so much for joining the show. I appreciate you. There's only one question that we ask every single guest that's scripted, and it's a difficult one because it's very personal. If you had to go to the absolutely most difficult moment of your life, what would be the advice you gave yourself?
Yeah, so I guess the probably the most difficult moment would be when we moved in with my stepfather. That was like the beginning of things turning much, much worse. And I guess the advice that I would think about giving her would be to try to find help for the emotional impact of living with that level of violence, because I didn't tell, like, let's say, a teacher or try to find if there was a counselor. It just didn't occur to me to do any of those kind of things. And so if there would have been someone to help me through that pain, even if they couldn't have stopped it, if they could have helped me handle it better, that could have made a huge difference.
You wrote a book about this experience, and I want all of the audience to go buy it. Tell us the name of the book.
Yeah, so the book is called From Junkie to Judge: One Woman's Triumph Over Trauma and Addiction. And I will say, I really tried to make the book useful, which is my goal with everything that I'm doing now that I'm retired. But the first third of the book is sort of my pre-drug childhood, because I wanted to show where it comes from, because I don't think people really appreciate that or have a deepest understanding as would be helpful. And then it's sort of the middle, the usual, chaos and misery of the drug addiction. But the last third is recovery, my first 3 years of recovery, because I wanted sort of a more realistic example, but also how did I build that sort of individual plan? What strategies or techniques might be useful to other people? So that's sort of how I thought about the book. How can I how can I make the book helpful to others? That was sort of a big part of the goal.
Now, can just anybody learn something from the book?
Yeah, because I mean, look, it's really a story of overcoming challenges, right? And so we all have different challenges in our life, but it can be a story about how to address those challenges, how to move past those challenges, and a lot of the strategies that I used are applicable to pretty much anything that you might be in recovery from. And most people have something, whether it's food or gambling or just grief or or pain of some type. So I think in that sense, it is universally useful to see it as a story of finding a way out.
Mary Beth, thank you so much for joining the show today. I appreciate you.
Thank you. Thanks. It's been a great discussion. I appreciate it as well.